Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to today's video. And in our last video we looked at how we can add images to our web page. Now in today's video we're going to be looking at forms. Now forms are one of the most important elements in your HTML web page because those are one of the only ways your user can actually interact with your website. Now first of all, I want to put this side by side so we can easily work. So first of all, let's get rid of this sidebar, then remove these images. Okay, so now to create a new form in HTML, we use the form tag. So now let's just remove this action, then enter a new line. Now the first thing in our form tag will be the input tag. Now this is how we structure a form in HTML. Anything you want to be inside this form must be inside the form tag. So now we'll put the input tag, and the input tag is among the self-closing tags. So now the first, let's save this and refresh. Now you can see an input where you can actually type. Okay, so now the first thing that we're going to be looking at on the input tag will be the type attribute. Now the type attribute is what specifies what type of input this is. Now as you can see, we have different types. We have the email, the file, image, number, password, text, and a whole bunch of others. So the first thing we're going to do is to use the text type. Now the text type is the default type for inputs in HTML. Then let's save this and refresh, and nothing actually changes. The next tag that we're going to be looking at is the label tag. Now the label tag is very useful when you want your users to actually know what this input is about. So now we put the tag label. Then in the label, set this to be the username input. So now let's refresh this. Okay, save and refresh. So now you should see username next to the input. Now one thing we can use label tags for is to link that label to your input. Now let's say you want that when the user clicks this username label, they should be focused on this input. Now one way to achieve that is by setting an ID on this input. Now the ID is an attribute in HTML that you can set on any tag, but we'll look more on that in later videos. So we set an ID and can set this to username, small caps. Then copy this username and put it in this for attributes. Now the for attribute is what links this label to this input. So now you save this, and always make sure that any label you're trying to link to an input must have the ID of that input in the for attributes. So now let's refresh this, and if you see, when I click this, the cursor gets focused on this input. Now another tag we'll be looking at is still the input, but with a type of checkbox. Let's save this and refresh. Okay, first of all, let's put this on different lines. So let's just wrap this in the paragraph tag, and this also. Now save this and refresh. Now it's on a different line. Now checkbox is just for a user to select or deselect an option. Now you mostly see this in sign up or login forms where it tells you to stay logged in or not. So let's add a label before the input that says, okay, remember me. So save this, and just like the username label, we can also link this to this checkbox so that when the user clicks on this remember me label, the checkbox should also get checked. So let's move this behind it and set an ID to remember me. So copy this and put it in the for attribute. So you refresh, and whenever the user clicks on this remember me, the checkbox will also get checked. Okay, so the next one we'll be looking at is still an input but with the type of radio. So input, we'll set the type to radio. So let's save this and refresh. Now this is how the radio button is. It's like a checkbox but used differently. So if I select this, you can see that it's selected. Now this is mostly used in an array of options. So let's say you want to get the age of the user, whether a user is over 18 or under 18. You can use something like this. So let me show you how we can use this. So first, let's add a label for this radio button and set it to over 18. Then let's add an ID to link this label, the ID of over 18. Copy this and paste it into the label, into the for attribute. You want to refresh. Whenever we click this, it selects that radio button. Then let's have a second one. Just put this in the same paragraph that says under 18. Let's save this and refresh. So we have over 18 and under 18. But now we want our user to be able to select only one of these. Now how do we do that? Now to do that in HTML, you use the name attribute. And name attribute is an attribute that can only add to form elements. Now form elements are things like the inputs, buttons, and others. So we'll still look at them, but now let's add a name attribute to these two radio buttons. Now to make sure that these two radio buttons can only be selected, that only one of these options can be selected, you have to set the name attribute to the same thing for both radio buttons. So I can just set this to age, then save. So when I refresh this, when we click over 18 and try to click on the 18, we should only be able to click one, just like that. Okay, so now the next tag we'll be looking at is the select tag. Now the select tag, just like the name probably implies, is a drop down where a user can select different options from. So it's like an alternative to using the input type of radio, but they can both be used simultaneously in your forms. So let's say we want to ask our user for their favorite food. So first let's add a label, favorite food. Now in the select tag takes the option tags. So option, and we have a value and where we type in. So we can put for the first option that says choose your favorite food. So now we'll leave the value attribute empty. So now we haven't looked at this, but the value attributes on form elements, it's just what tells our browser or whatever file is processing this form after submission what each of these inputs or select drop downs actually carry and what they are sending. So for instance, the option tag does not have text where you can just type in, so it's a drop down where you select. Normally this will send the value without us setting any value, because if we set a value attribute here, so if I set the value to my name and we refresh this, you will see that the value is set to Destiny, and let's say we want to type in a name, Mike. So when this form gets submitted, by default this is what will be sent to our back end. So we don't need to set a default value for input tags of type text. But for a drop down, after submission, the form does not send whatever is inside this option tag, but what is in this value. So when this form is submitted, what this option is telling our browser is this select tag is sending an empty value, which will actually throw an error if we add validation. So let's just continue and we'll look at that later in detail when we're getting more advanced into this course. So let's put the first option to be rice. Then just know that anytime you put in an option here, you should also set the corresponding option in the value attributes. So put rice, then yam, and let's just put snack. Pizza. So now when we save this and refresh, you can see select drop down here. So let me add something to make it look a bit better and save. So I can see our select drop down here. You can select rice and the value here changes, yam, the value changes, and pizza. So next we also have to link this label to this drop down. So just like how I've done before, all you have to do is set an ID, and we can just call this favorite food, and that ID is what we will now put in the for attribute. Then we'll save this, and when we select, it focuses on this drop down. Okay, so we have a couple more input types to go. So let's look at a very important one, which is the submit. So there are two ways to add a submit button in a form in HTML. The first way is using the input tag and setting the type to submit. So I'll save this and refresh. Okay, we'll need to add a value here, submit. We'll save this. Now we can see a submit text here. So what this button just does is it submits the form values. So if I check, remember me, add a name, and I submit this, okay, first of all we have to add names to each and every one of these inputs. So when building a form, all your inputs should have a name, so that when that form is submitted, we can actually know which values are being sent. So if you don't add a name when submitting, those form inputs will not be sent to the file for processing. So inputs, let's just select all this. Okay, name, just set this to username, set this to remember me. This already has a name. Now set this select drop down to favorite food. So let's save this and retry. So just check this, select one and submit. Now if you look in your URL, you can see some values were passed. So now username equals destiny, remember me equals on, age equals on, favorite food rice. So now we sent the values using this name attribute. If you notice, the username is what was set here. So if we change this to usernames and save, if we submit this form again, you will see the username changes to usernames equals destiny. So that's just how form works, and this is a bit advanced, but I just thought I should show you how the form submitting actually works. So that's just what the input type submit does. It submits the form values. Now another way to also do this is to use a button. So you can just add a text in the button which says submit. Now I want to refresh. By default, any button, okay, let's just add a text here to differentiate this line break. So now by default, any button you add to a form in HTML actually is set to a submit button. So if I click this, you'll see that the form got submitted. But if I set the type to button and save, you'll see that the submit button doesn't actually do anything because the type now is set to button. But with the type set to submit or just blank, this button will always submit the form when clicked. So that's how we can use some tags to add a submit button to our form. Now the next tag we're going to be looking at is, or attributes rather, is, as we've talked about, the value attributes. So you can use the value attribute to set a default value in a form. So if I want this value to be set to destiny by default, anytime the user loads up the page, we would see that once this value is set, every time the user loads up, this will always be in the username field. Now, but let's say we want to have a little text here that tells the user input your username, but we don't want to use the value, because if we use the value to do something like that and say input your username, anytime the user comes and tries to type in this form, we'll have to clear all this text and start typing. So the best way to do this is to use the placeholder attributes. Now what the placeholder attributes does is the same thing the value does, but it does not set the value of the input to this text, but just adds a faint text behind this input that just tells us what we need to do, and when you start typing, that text disappears. So that's it for the inputs. Now the next thing we're going to be looking at is on the type checkbox. Now let's say whenever your user comes to this form, you want to make sure that this checkbox is always checked, so then the user can now uncheck if they want. To do that, you use an attribute called checked. Now this only works on checkboxes and radio inputs. So when I save this and refresh, you will see it's set to checked. Now if you also do this on a radio button, save and refresh, you see that it's selected also. Okay, so now the last thing we'll be looking at is on this select drop down. So if you want to have a default value selected once the user loads up this page, you can use the selected attribute on one of these options. So if I go over to YAM and set selected and save, if you refresh this page, you will see that the favorite food by default is set to YAM. So if you click the drop down, you can see it's on YAM. So then the user can now change it to whatever they want. So that's how to set up a basic form in HTML. It's actually more complex when you're building something, but this is just the basics on how to do it. And in our next video, we'll be looking at HTML tables and how we can create them and structure them properly. So see you in that video. Bye.